Hi everyone, this is Joe from Bench Press. Thank you very much for tuning in to another episode. And today, we're going to be talking about national identity. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, national identity basically means a person or a group's sense of belonging towards a particular country or nation. So for example, I consider myself as an Indonesian because I was born and raised in Indonesia. I have Indonesian citizenship, and I'm generally quite well updated on the events that happen in Indonesia. So I would identify myself as an Indonesian. Now, national identity can be quite an interesting topic relating to peace, because on the one hand, national identity can unite people of different backgrounds. In Indonesia, for example, we have more than 1,000 ethnic groups, and yet all of us can unite ourselves as Indonesians. On the other hand, however, national identities can also lead to conflict. For example, it can cause people to become enemies with people of different national identities. Or think about how a weak national identity can often result in separatist movements. So, that's our topic for today. And for today's episode, we're going to be looking into the case of national identity in Singapore, because Singapore has often been described as having quite a unique conception of national identity. And to facilitate today's discussion, we have invited our friend James as our guest. James is one of our former classmates, and we invited him because, one, he's from Singapore, two, he actually wrote his graduation thesis on Singaporean national identity. So, without further ado, here's our conversation with James. Have a look. James, thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to Bench Press. How are you doing, my man?
Good to be here today. Good to be here. It's good to see all of you doing so well. And I'm excited to share my thoughts on Singapore and what you have in store for us. Yeah.
Do you miss school?
Actually, yes, I do really miss school. I think the biggest thing is actually the amount of free time you have. So, we think we're busy, at least during school, but when you get thrown into the workplace and you have to work, standard working hours, it's a bit of a slog sometimes. It's mentally draining as well. So, yeah, I do wish I was back in the good old days of sitting down and talking to you guys in class. But yeah, those are good times past, so.
Well, I'm still in grad school, but it's not all fun and roses too, But I guess you're right. Okay, but alright, so before we get down to our topic, James, why don't you say hi to our viewers and give them a brief introduction of yourself?
Hello, Benchfirst viewers. My name is James, and I have, I am a working adult in Japan right now. I come from Singapore, and I had my education in Ritsumeikan University, and I was from the College of International Relations. So I have a passion for discussing topics pertaining to this field. So yeah, I hope what I say will be of use to you when you think about this topic that we are about to discuss.
Right. Okay, thank you, James. So, as we all know, today we're going to be talking about national identity, and we're going to be using Singapore as a case study, and that's why we have James here in our podcast, because he's from Singapore, and two, he actually wrote his thesis on Singaporean national identity, right? Okay, so, why don't we kick off this discussion with a simple question? So, James, what does being a Singaporean mean to you?
That's actually a really, really interesting question, because to be a Singaporean, I feel, has so many different definitions. And I think you would already know because even from the Singaporeans that you've met in your lives, if you're from different walks of life, you probably have a very different definition of what it means to be a Singaporean, even though Singapore is just a really, really small city-state, right? So I can speak for my experiences. I can speak for myself. I would hesitate to do so for the entire Singaporean population, but I would argue that to be a Singaporean means that you identify with most of the civic values that make up the composition of the country, and these civic values can be values that have been passed down from generation to generation from our immigrant ancestors, or the civic values can be those enforced by the government, those put in place by the ruling People's Action Party. I think a subscription to these values makes one ultimately a Singaporean, because in this day and age, especially in a country where civic values, not cultural, I would say, a country that's not homogenous in identity, a country that's not reliant on solid cultural bedrock, you actually have a big, in a big way, you can actually change your subscription of ideals, of civic values. So in Singapore's case, as long as you believe in these values, I would say that you are sufficiently Singaporean.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the values part is also a very interesting and important part. So, for example, me being an Indonesian means being, I think, being united in diversity, for example. It's actually in our national motto as well. We have 6 official religions, more than 300 ethnic groups, but we all recognize ourselves as Indonesians. And for example, another maybe values that we value is is this thing that we call gotong royong, which basically means like working together. So like helping others in need, fulfill our obligations towards society. These are also some of the things that we often say make up our identity as Indonesians. So we actually have another Indonesian in our podcast here, right? Andrew is also from Indonesia. So why don't I ask Andrew the same question as well? So Andrew, what do you think being an Indonesian means to you?
Well, it's kind of a hard question. I think being an Indonesian means accepting diversity. As you guys probably know, and for those of you who don't know, Indonesia is a very diverse country. It consists of, I think, 33 provinces, right, Joe? And
Probably more now, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot of races and ethnicities and backgrounds that make up Indonesian societies, and it can be pretty challenging for those people to mix together within like a country, and we're trying, I think, every day to be accepting of one another, and yeah. So I think the essence of being an Indonesian is just accepting each other and respecting each other's boundaries, and I think it's still a challenge, but we're getting there, hopefully.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Right. How about you, Aki? So Aki is actually a very special case here, very interesting case, because Aki is half Japanese and half Filipino. So, Aki, how about you? Like, what would you consider as your national identity, and what does it mean to you?
I think in terms of national identity, I would consider myself stronger on the Filipino side. Because I think like what James said, it's more on the values, right? And for, I think, Filipinos, it's more on the cultural values than the civic values. And like one example would be how deep is like us being family oriented. And I'm not saying that Japan is not family oriented, but I think the treatment towards family is warmer in the Philippines rather than here in Japan. And it is very different once I experience it living here. And I identify myself more on the Filipino side because I grew up to its values. Unlike for Japan, I'm still learning a lot of things. I'm still discovering new cultures that I haven't experienced when I'm young. So I think it also your national identity or how you define yourself really varies on your experiences from the past life you've been into. So yeah, I think that's for me.
Right. Yeah. And so when we discuss this like off screen, like when we're discussing how we're gonna do this episode with Aki asked me a very interesting question. So like Andre and I are Chinese Indonesians, right? So Aki asked us whether or not we also have like trouble identifying, let's say, between Indonesian and Chinese. But our case is a bit different from Aki because being Chinese Indonesian, the Chinese part of my identity is a cultural identity, not a national identity. So like if you ask me what my national identity is, it's Indonesian. So I don't have any affiliation with mainland China or China. Yeah, so I guess I would say Andrew would agree with me as well. So do you have any views on that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think so. We are pretty detached, I guess, in a way, with our ancestors from mainland China. We're more, I think we're kind of in the middle, in a weird position, in a bind, I guess, that we're trying to assimilate with Indonesian society, but at the same time we're still kind of a marginal community. Although we're successful in the business side of the spectrum, so it's kind of a weird state that we're in. But I think recently people are becoming more and more accepting, and yeah, it's just a very interesting position for us, I guess.
Yeah, so like, just want to clear up that misconception, I guess, what people have when people think about Chinese Indonesians. So I think, speaking about misconceptions, so let's go back to Singapore, since that's what we're discussing here. So James, what do you think is the most common misconception about Singaporean national identity or being a Singaporean? Misconceptions about being a Singaporean.
I feel like this would probably tie into what I mentioned previously, that the misconception normally is that Singaporean national identity is very monolithic. So it's something that's very one size fit all. It's something that's very it's something that's very, very applicable to everyone in every situation, right? Because I would bring in a real life example. You would know our good friend Yume is also from Singapore, and I can say almost with absolute certainty that if we didn't meet in Ritz-Macon, I would have never met a person like her in Singapore, even though the place is so small, and I would never have had any crossover with anyone from her walk of life. So, and you know from your own personal experiences, talking to her, that the values she subscribes to are, I won't say that they're absolutely, different from the ones I subscribe to, but there is a significant portion that doesn't overlap with what I would consider to be Singaporean, but those values are no less Singaporean in their own regard. So I think that's the biggest thing that, I'd like to say, because for a lot of people, especially, when we have, Japanese friends in Japan who have, not much exposure or not much interaction with the outside world, they tend to use their own understanding of what a national identity should be, what a makeup or what the application of a national identity should be, and think of Singapore as, if we meet a Singaporean and a Singaporean is behaving like X, then all Singaporeans should probably behave like X, right?
Right.
And I think this is also reflected in I think this is really interesting because I see, as fellow, I guess people of Southeast Asia, I feel like Singaporeans tend to not come together that often in terms of, when they meet outside, or they don't tend to, group together when they go outside. And I think this stems from the fact that everyone has different values that they subscribe to. And we don't deny, that these values are obviously Singaporean, but these are some things that, I think tends to give, our foreign friends a bit of confusion sometimes, because they're like, I know ex-Singaporean who's behaving like this. Why is Singaporean so weird? Like, what is he actually doing? Right? So, you might have thought that, in your own, encounters with various Singaporeans, over the course of 4 years in Ritz-Macon. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing. And I think once you get used to it, you realize that it's probably a more sane task to regard an interaction with a Singaporean as an interaction with an individual that's holding a red passport and a pink IC than with a monolithic, socio-economic group that's from that small island nation.
Yeah, that's true. I think that applies to like other groups as well, right? So we can't really it's really hard. We can't really overgeneralize everything, and there are some traits you can find common in a certain group, but it doesn't mean that every individual acts like that's within that certain characteristic, right? Okay. So let's try to discuss like how Singapore national identity was formulated. So I think James already mentioned just now about civic nationalism. National identity in Singapore was constructed based on civic values and all that. And so I've read James' graduation thesis before, because like we share our thesis, right? So James, in your graduation thesis, you argued that the formation of Singapore's national identity actually defied traditional wisdom because it was formed without the presence of conventional building blocks of identity construction, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like, what do you mean by conventional building blocks, and how exactly does Singapore's national identity formation defy the traditional wisdom?
Thank you. First off, thank you for reading my thesis. It's a bit of a slog, but thankfully you got through it. So I feel like the formation of Singapore's national identity, as I discussed it in my thesis, revolves around the concept known as national creation myths. So national creation myths are basically myths that are elevated to the point of being irrefutable in the makeup of a country's social fabric or cultural fabric. So, for example, something that would be relevant in Japan would be the first emperor Jimmu being descended from Amaterasu, and like the whole sun god shtick, and everything is being holy and great, and the line is being uninterrupted through the patrilineal line of succession down till our current emperor today, right? Emperor Naruhito. So that would be an example of a cultural creation myth in the form of Japan, right? But Singapore, being not even 60 years of age as we record this, if I do, I'm pretty sure it's not 60 yet, but I might be getting old, and if I do get this wrong, we can probably edit something and splice it in. So Singapore is a really, really young country. We don't really think about this, but when we have like our parents' generation, right? When you think about our parents, my parents are specifically at the cutoff where they are just older than my country. That is a very weird statement to make in this day and time where we have countries that are essentially they're very established. You could argue that for a lot of different countries, their modern the modern republic version of that country has not existed for that long, but the country has basically remained intact throughout foreign occupation, throughout cultural I guess influx in certain times when you had the great trading eras, when you had ships going around the globe, and Singapore doesn't really have that, right? Singapore is so young that any coherent attempt at trying to piece together a story kind of makes it seem a bit flippant in its attempt, because you can't realistically claim a really long line of heroes or great men or even great women or just gods and kings when you essentially don't have any of these things, right? And if you really want to go back down in history, you would actually trace back to the Jawa traders who came to the island, or the island was originally under the supervision of the Tunkus and basically the old kings that were in Malaysia. So the more you trace back, the more you don't have, I feel, in a very big way, because those things, while yes, they are history and they are at least in the current Singaporean history syllabus, they are being taught as part of Singapore's, I guess, native history in a sense, like the history of the land as compared to the history of the nation. But in this sense, it's not really, it doesn't run parallel to any kind of modern narrative that pertains to current Singapore. So it's good as a add-on to what we have. But I would say that in this regard, when we talk about national creation myths, it doesn't actually, correspond to anything we have right now. And going on to the point where, we don't have anything natural in the creation of the national identity, then if a national identity as we regard it is so crucial to the congealing of a nation, it's the glue that holds everything together, right? It's the glue that prevents your citizens from fleeing aboard and not, not identifying with anything that your country says. It's so important. So, well, I guess you then have to make it, right? You then have to make it. So therein comes the, I won't even say accusation, because I think a lot of Singaporeans really just, we readily admit that everything is pretty artificial in Singapore, including our nation, our nationhood, right? And I think this would, you can stop my grandfather's story whenever, because I'll probably talk a bit about the pioneer generation of leaders that we have, and they basically created something out of nothing, right? Something out of nothing, and while we can debate, how these stories are accurate or inaccurate, or whether they, embellish the roles of the pioneer leaders, because if you're going to create a story and you're going to write yourself as the protagonist, you're going to write yourself as the good guys, right? I mean, I think this is conventional play, at least in nation building. So with this in mind, everything's very artificial, everything's very manufactured in a way. So it also gave rise to a part of Singaporeans, in the modern day, not really identifying with a lot of the things that the government says, right? Because as we reach or as we cross the 50-year threshold of Singapore, it becomes a lot harder, right? Because for the pioneer generation, at least they had the clear goal of making sure that the economic side of the country's prosperity was solid, right? So they achieved that goal. They created, basically, I quote, an air-conditioned nation where people are insulated from the outside. They work, they excel, they earn their keep. We have government housing. We have the sponsored by the Housing Development Board. Everything's basically fine. But then, as we understand in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you have basically economic prosperity, you go up the rung.
You want more.
You go up the rung in terms of what you desire. And for Singaporeans, many of them in my generation, we think about, it's a good place. Our parents earn their keep here. They are essentially very grateful to the government or to the country because they gave them a place to excel. But for us, having grown up in this, I guess, prosperous, safe environment, we want more things, right? We want more civil freedoms. We want more ways to express ourselves. We don't want to be, carved out of the same mold that is our education system. Not to say that the education system is bad. It's pretty good, but, it really hammers down certain I guess creative faculties of people. So it's, this is really interesting, because I think we're at a crossroads where a lot of people just they want out. They want out of the system. And I think it's really up to the current government to think about what actually is, which ties in very well to what we're discussing today. What actually is a good way to ensure, national identity cohesiveness, especially if you don't have a solid bedrock of cultural foundation to work with, right? And I would say, as a biased Singaporean looking at their salaries, they should probably come up with something, because they are, one of a group of politicians or administrators that are the highest paid in the world. So they probably should come up with something before we lose more of our talent outside.
Okay, wait, James. So just to cut you, sorry to cut you off there for a second, but there were a lot of interesting that you mentioned just now. So, for example, were you implying that whether or not people subscribe to particular national identity also depends on the benefits they get from being a part of the national identity? For example, you mentioned about economic development, right? So, so please correct me if I'm wrong, okay? But you're suggesting that because they were working together towards a common goal, that is economic development, it kind of strengthens their sense of national identity. But now that you've achieved economic development, you kind of need more. You kind of want more benefits, or like more things that you can work on in order to strengthen that national identity. Is that right?
I would say yes. And the issue I feel with that is that it's kind of like, I'll compare this to fair weather fans in sports, because when you build so much of your national identity on succeeding, which is a good thing if you do succeed, and your citizens generally believe that they are the winners in the small circle that is Southeast Asia. I will not comment more on that. But there are a significant portion of Singaporeans who believe, thank God for being born in Singapore. So it's okay. It's okay. But then if, growth can't remain exponential forever, right? If you start at a lower point, you can accelerate, right? But once you reach the cutoff, which is basically, saturated markets and everything else, then what you have is the current state of things. And I think it's pretty obvious that the current government can't realistically deliver the amount of, I guess, economic winning that their predecessors delivered, right? It's actually impossible, right? It's actually impossible. So then you have an issue because you build your national identity on success. And I wouldn't say that this was fully intentional because in the development of Singapore, as I mentioned, Singapore, just under 60 years of development. When success becomes so much of your brand, right? And, as we talk about the four Asian tigers, we talk about we talk about a little island nation that could blah blah blah, right? When that becomes so integrated into your history, it kind of stands out, right? It kind of stands out. And when it's something that's exceptionally positive, you wouldn't try to undermine yourself or undermine your own brand, your national brand by covering it, right? And then it, by one way or another, it becomes so crucial or so core to your national identity that now when you can't deliver, like I mentioned, the fair weather fans are like, well, Singapore was winning previously, but I guess we're not winning that much anymore. I guess, if I have the economic means, or I have, if I subscribe to other nations that have, a more concrete civic value system that appeals more to me, why not uproot myself, maybe my family as well, and head off, right?
Right.
Maybe that is the solution, and that is something that is very very apparent. And just to end this point off before I ramble too much, this is really relevant because I think the daughter of our second Prime Minister, Goh Chok Tong, she's actually settled in a foreign land. If I'm not mistaken, it's the UK, and a lot of people gave him a lot of heat for that because if you're doing such a good job, why are your kids not here? Right? That's a really potent question, and I think that probably answers the query.
Right. Okay.
James,
Okay,
I just have a question, but it's a bit different from the economic part. I want to talk about language because I do believe that Singapore has this Singlish language, which is very interesting. So I want to know your thoughts on, do you consider Singlish as part of your national identity as a Singaporean?
So very relevant. Singlish has been, for good or for worse, a really core part of Singaporean identity, and people talk about Singlish, and I would say when I go outside, it is, they don't really talk about it in a derogatory term, but it's something that this is, maybe I'll get bashed for this, but it kind of negatively impacts your, I guess, economic viability in a sense, because it's, I feel like it goes through, like it works in Singapore, right? It works in Singapore. It's very obviously a crucial part of Singapore national identity because, when you share a certain code, right? Because all languages are basically codes. And if you share a certain code with someone, you immediately click, right? For example, if I could speak Bahasa with you, then I would be basically like honorary Indonesian or whatever because I could pass off. Yeah. So that's just how it works, right? Especially if, you would know because, for us who speak, like say the Japanese language, if you try to use Japanese to talk to a Japanese person, as compared to English, right? Even though, they're fluent in both languages, it's very different, their response to you, right? It's very different. as to how much they open up. So it's definitely very important. And as something that's very unique to Singapore, you can't find it anywhere else. People say that at least amongst the Straits Chinese, some of them basically in Malaysia as well, they also have a certain variation of that. But Singlish is for all intents and purposes uniquely Singaporean. So it's very crucial to Singaporean national identity just by considering that it's not available anywhere else, right? But if you're talking about whether it's a boon or a bane, I lean towards it not being too good if you can't code switch, right? So
so for our viewers who haven't noticed, James is not speaking in Singlish right now, even though he's a Singaporean. Yeah. So go ahead.
But I am also not, I'm not like, I don't really subscribe to like, we need to, go full on, Western accenty or whatever, right? But I feel like there's a certain, code for a certain place and time. So it wouldn't make sense because if I would speak Singlish to all of you, I mean, you're not from Singapore, right? So it doesn't fulfill the purpose of communication, right? So in discussing how Singlish is useful, yes, it's useful for creating an inside bubble, right? It's useful for creating an in-group. But outside of that, it's rather detrimental if you can't code switch. And I think that is a really, really prevalent problem in, today's Singapore. Many others would disagree, but I think this is something that we need to look into because the more we can't code switch, the more it becomes an issue outside of Singapore, right? If you live your entire life in Singapore, nobody cares, right? It wouldn't impact anything. But the moment you go outside, you realize, it's not something that's exceptionally ideal. So I'm actually kind of conflicted, over this point, right? Because I don't think any other country that has its, first language recognized as English has this much of a disparity between, what's actually spoken amongst the masses compared to what people assume you should be able to speak outside with them. So, yeah, this is a very very interesting topic. I might come up with a different answer if you ask me.
No, yeah. And the Singaporean government has actually tried to ban Singlish before, right? Is the government still trying to do that, or like what are some of the progress there?
What's the progress on that? If we're just looking from the progress, then I don't think there has been much
the
progress.
development.
Yeah. Pardon me. So, I just, I feel like the government tried, and I look at, their attempts at eradicating Singlish as part of the, the modus operandi of the pioneer generation of leaders, because a lot of them were basically English educated, in England, right? English educated. And they spoke, I guess, perfect Queen's English. And that was their ideal for the nation. And as much as they understood that this was a Herculean task, because not everyone, can be molded into, the way that they envisioned the nation to be, they still tried, right? They still tried. And, I think that the current generation of leaders, don't have that flame in them. Not to criticize them that, for having this drive to tackle this, to call it an issue is already being slightly biased, but I'll just call it an issue right now. So to tackle this issue, but you can probably, pull up clips of our current, fourth generation of leaders after Lee Hsien Loong, because Lee Hsien Loong, our current Prime Minister of Singapore, is still, he speaks perfect English, Chinese, and Malay. And it would make sense because I would assume his father, who was our first Prime Minister, was very strict with his upbringing. But now we can, when we look at our fourth generation of leaders, just to, give a rough rundown, we have, Heng Swee Keat, we have Chan Chun Sing, and we have, others like Gan Kim Yong and Lawrence Wong, and if you just pull up some of their speeches, which I think should be available on YouTube, they don't exhibit that kind of finesse in a way. Yeah, and this is something that we I can talk about that a bit later, so we can move on right now.
Right.
So James, there was a very interesting discussion we had, and I certainly learned a lot more about national identity and how it's, I guess, perceived differently from what our understanding of national identity is really about. And I think we should head into a more lighthearted question. Let's talk about food, and I see how Singapore is often synonymously identified with its food and its hawker center. And I think in this respect, we can agree that food plays an integral part in the creation of Singaporean national identity. So I guess the first question is the perception of food being a part of national identity a manufactured thing? Or do you think it was not? And if so, how was it manufactured?
Okay, thank you. We are at the fun part of the conversation right now.
Yep.
We're at the part where I think you definitely love, and I definitely love. So let's get into it. And so for food, on the more academic side of things, I would say that our food is basically consuming food is a national pastime in Singapore. And it is actually like it's a legacy, right? It's a legacy of our immigrant past, because a lot of these dishes that are currently here in Singapore are basically remnants of the household recipes of old, right? So in a way, it's a constant reminder of our diversity, and it's also a constant reminder of how we came to this land together, and our ancestors basically came to this land together. And, they, despite their differences, despite, initially not being able to even communicate with each other, they decided to forge a future with each other in this land. And I think that kind of, camaraderie really adds a lot to our national identity. And, some of you might think, it's just food, right? Why do you have to make it so complicated? It's just delicious, right? But I would also, like to state that, with a lot of things we have, we normally, it's not like you really like hard nationalism in the sense that, people get offended at certain things. But, with regards to, things like, I guess, chicken rice or even nasi lemak or just roti prata or whatever, right? They tend to have their own local arrangements to them in their creation. So they're kind of different from, I guess, the original that's made, say, in Malaysia or in India or, back in China, right? Some of these dishes don't even exist, I guess, back in the original countries right now, right? And I think you would be no stranger to being nationalistic over food, because, if I were to ask you, was it nasi biryani or nasi padang? Like, which country does it belong to? Right? I would get a lot of different answers if I were to ask someone else from a different country. So, yeah,
That's a pretty offensive question.
That's a pretty offensive question. Yeah, I apologize for my cultural insensitivity. Very offensive question, right?
Yeah, but claiming of like cultural properties or like food and stuff like that, it's also a hot topic in, let's say, Indonesia and Malaysia,
right.
Because well, the borders that separate Indonesia and Malaysia today is very new, right? It used to be like it's there because of history of colonialism, but before it used to be like a bunch of kingdoms, and a lot of cultures are shared. So it's actually quite strange as well that we are very nationalistic about stuff that all of us share, Yeah. Right.
Okay, so since we're pretty tight on time, let's quickly move on to the next question, okay? Interestingly, what makes Singaporean experiences with food and identity different from other countries? Like, why is it? I guess I don't know. I don't see food as a wholly part of what makes Indonesian national identity like big. But I think in Singapore, it is a very big part of it. Like what is it that makes it so different?
Um, I would hesitate to say it's totally different because I feel like in a lot of different countries, they all play a centralizing role in the sense that, the table where we share our meals is also a table or a ground for social interaction, right? It's a ground where people of different walks of life, they all sit down, we're all equal at the table and we're all, having the same food if we're eating together, right? So I think that builds a sense of communal bonding. And I guess for Singapore, it's highlighted so much more, because, again, of, I would assume to be logistical reasons, because in Singapore, because of our lack of, our lack of long-standing history and our lack of everything else, food just stands out as something that bonds people together, right? So, for example, if you have, let's just say in the case of Japan, right? If you have, beautiful mountains, you have rivers, you have hot springs, you have so many different things, right? That are so great and so iconic of the country, then, you don't really need to focus on the food. For example, you have like, say, festivals. For example, in Kyoto, we have the Gion Festival, right? You have the Gion Festival, and much of the festival is centered on the tradition, the culture, that has been passed down throughout the generations. The food, right? From what I understand from going there, every year, is that the food is basically very commercialized now. It's basically just the same stalls selling the same yakisoba, selling the same frankfurt, selling the same things every year by year, right? But nobody really complains about it. Nobody really says, this is not Japanese, why are we selling these things when our ancestors in the past, they didn't really, sell these things, right? These aren't really Japanese. Nobody really cares because the main focus of that is the cultural aspect, right? But in Singapore, we don't really have things that exude such a big cultural influence. So I think, the food aspect of that just kind of picked up the slack and it became representative of the national identity in that regard.
Interesting. I've never really seen it that way. I guess the small things is really what makes national identity, huh?
That's true. Absolutely.
Perfect. Okay. Next topic, Hanjo.
All right, that was a very interesting topic about national identity and food. Yeah. Okay, so we all know that the overarching theme of our podcast here is about peace. So of course we want to try to tie everything about peace as well. So first of all, let me just try to clarify some of the stuff I asked previously. So I think previously I asked about the benefits. So people are more inclined to identify to feel with their a particular national identity if they also get the benefit from it, right? I think that's also a very a big part. It's also a very big part of a lot of separatist movements, for example, like maybe in Papua, in Indonesia. I think a lot of people in Papua are not really feeling like there are separatist movements there because one of the reasons is that that part of Indonesia is not very developed. It feels like the government is neglecting them. So I think, we can also see this in Hong Kong, for example, when Hong Kong was given back to China. So I read an article saying that in the first years, Hong Kongers were still able to identify themselves as Chinese, but as time passes by, they're identifying themselves more as Hong Kongers, for example. Yeah. Okay. So now so on the topic of peace and national identity, one of the issues that I want to raise is national identity is it's a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, a strong national identity can unite people under a shared sense of belonging. Like, for example, Indonesia has more than 300 ethnic groups, but we all identify ourselves as Indonesians. But on the other hand, it can also cause xenophobia, mistrust against people of different national identities, and even lead to conflicts. A lot of wars actually happen because of national identities, right? So, James, in your opinion, how nationalistic are Singaporeans? has there been any notable cases in Singapore where national identity becomes a motivation or justification for conflict?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. With regards to conflict, I'd just like to ask before I answer the question. So, do you refer to conflicts within Singapore when people disagree on the direction of the country, or do you are you referring to Singapore having a conflict externally with another country because of nationalism?
For me, it's more on externally. Well, if you have any points about the internal part, you feel free to talk about it as well. But yeah, I think my question is more on the external side. It can be anything. So maybe like nationalism in sports or anything that causes conflict. Yeah.
Thank you. For Singapore, I'd just like to say that Singapore punches above its weight in terms of international presence. But when you actually come to entertaining the thought of having conflict, we simply can't because, we don't have hard power, basically. The country is small. We rely almost exclusively on trade and on the tertiary industry to basically keep ourselves afloat.
Okay, I see it. All right. Thank you very much, James, for that interesting comments. All right. So I think we're running out of time soon. With this podcast drag on pretty long. So just one final question, so we can close this podcast. So, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from Singapore's recipe for national identity construction?
So for lessons we can learn, I think, as we mentioned, it's extremely manufactured. So for any country that eventually has to create a certain identity, I think it's very applicable. So things like, I think the government basically has to have a strong control over the narrative, because I think the main thing that you have to provide, or the main thing you have to ensure that goes your way or goes the way of your narrative, is education, right? It's very hard to convince people to buy into something if they already have, a good 40, 50 years of their lives believing in something else. But if people are, if they grow up in the system, they take what you see in the system as their reality. And that's a lot more, I guess, convenient for the people in power. And other than having control over the narrative, you need to make sure that your narrative is basically sustainable. Because if you propose something that's not sustainable, the country just, or the identity basically just disintegrates after maybe, after one generation of leaders, after 2 generations of leaders. So I think with the creation of a national identity, political power is extremely important. And it's not only political power concentrated on a single person, but concentrated in institutions and civic values and systems that can actually withstand the test of time. And with that said, you need to have politicians that look out for the greater good. And those are an extremely rare breed in today's climate. So I wouldn't, with that in mind, right, with realistic constraints in mind, I wouldn't say that this is extremely applicable to everyone or every country, because, obviously some countries have politicians that don't really think in the long term. So, I would say that, yeah, that would be my take on it. And if any, new country or any existing country wishes, to sort of, put their mark on, what their new national identity should be, then I think it's a really, really big political undertaking. And I wish them the best of luck in doing that.
All right, wonderful. Okay, I think that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much, James, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Okay, so that was our talk with James. I really enjoyed it. That was a very interesting and insightful one. And it's been a while since I think many of us talked to him as well. So I really enjoyed that session. So what do you guys think of the talk today? And what are your takeaways?
My takeaways on James. Well, I'm glad he's doing fine. I'm glad that he's there for us when we need it the most.
Wow.
Because I mean, like
Wow.
it's been like what 6 months, right? 4 to 6 months, I guess, since I last saw him in Japan, and
That long? Oh, okay. Yeah.
yeah, right. Cut to the chase. Regarding the interview, I really think it's interesting. It gives me an impression, I guess, in a way that that's initially before the interview, I really thought that Singapore is a harmonious society. It is a peaceful society with, multiculturalism, I guess, and a lot of races in Singapore.
Wait,
And
did you say
and you know
racist?
that
or-
he mentioned it as well with Singlish and food culture binding them all together, right? And I guess just from the interview, it kind of shows that the multicultural society that Singapore is, it's not as peaceful, I guess, or there's also an ongoing debate about a lot of things. He mentioned about Singlish, the banning of Singlish and stuffs, and yeah, I just think that Indonesia can learn a lot, especially from the national identity of Singapore.
Right.
What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Sorry
yeah,
for
well,
taking a lot of time.
Yeah, well, for me, one of my key takeaways for this episode is that national identity and how states can forge a strong and enduring one is also closely related to the benefits and the level of equality that the people can get from being a part of that nation, right? So I remember during the interview session, I mentioned about the case of Papua in Indonesia and Hong Kong in China, for example. So with the case of Indonesia, development is still very unequal, right, among different regions in the country. And Papua is often neglected by the central government, or at least the previous ones. And so our friends in Papua are not getting the benefits of being a part of Indonesia as much as people in Jakarta, for example, which is much more developed, right? So that's also one of the reasons why there are separatist movements, right? And with the case of Hong Kong, many people in Hong Kong were able to identify themselves as Chinese in the early years after Hong Kong was returned to China, right? But as the Chinese government started to become more assertive toward Hong Kong, many Hong Kong people are now identifying themselves as Hong Kongers instead of Chinese. So basically, what I got here is that it really shows how a strong national identity is also associated with equality and good treatment. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of equality, I think that's how we can relate it to peace as well. If we would think, because for among of our all topic, I guess national identity, people would think, oh, how is it related with peace? But actually, it's very related in a sense that national identity, as you said, can provide equality, and also it can provide people the unity and peace, especially for a community that has been divided to different social groups. Just like in Singapore, there are a lot of different social groups, and we all know that. But it did not hinder, or it did not become a reason for them to clash with each other, but rather they found peace and unity from being a Singaporean. And if you try to look at it, there's still a lot of countries or communities that are still in search for their national identity, and implementing it, having a national identity for your country is not as easy as it could, it's not as easy as what you think, because this would really, as James mentioned, it will really need a political change, and the main actor, or probably the most important actor, would be the politicians that care for the people. And I think that's how we could say that national identity is really an important factor that might lead a community to peace.
Yeah. Just adding to what everyone had mentioned, I think every point that you mentioned was very, very important, especially I think, and I also think that Singapore could be like a successful story of building a national identity, listening to James interview, and I think it could be a very good role model to all of the nation that is still searching for national identity. And therefore, as Joe and Aki mentioned, I think the most important thing to construct a very good national identity is where no one left behind, and hence it will enhance harmony. How do you say it? How do you say it will increase the sense of belonging towards your national identity.
Right. And it doesn't even have to be limited to like national identity. It can be something even more broader. For example, regional identity. We know how, for example, ASEAN has been trying to ASEAN has been trying to create this sense of regionalism, right? Trying to create like a sense of regional identity, a sense of community among like the Southeast Asian countries. But of course, it's also hard because Southeast Asian countries are very diverse politically, in terms of politically, ethnically, and everything. So, yeah, it can also be applied to like other cases of other identities, basically.
That's true. I mean, like, even though ASEAN is having, just in addition to that, even though ASEAN is having, a hard time, at least just creating that regional group, I think in that sense, they found, how do you say it, like, common, not goal, but something same
A
for
common
each.
goal, yeah.
Yeah, something same for each of the countries. And I think that's what is important. Like, something that would bind you. Something that would, even just one factor is okay. Just to say that we are one, we are the same. As Dika said, no one will be left behind. So it's like the feeling of inclusion, I should say. So I think that's how important as well is not only national, regional, but the identity itself, right?
Right, yeah.
All in all, I think Singapore really, I guess, do a great job, I guess, of having a strong national identity for, or building a strong national identity for their citizen. And yeah, I do agree with what Joe said, which is like really interesting for me as well to think about that, equality really plays a part in terms of national identity. And yeah, certainly for, I can only talk for my country, Indonesia, right? We can learn a lot from them.
Right. Just to add another point to the discussion, and especially if we want to relate it to like our overarching theme, which is peace, right? Is that I believe I also mentioned this in the interview session, but national identity can be a double-edged sword, right? So like it can unite people, but on the one hand, it can also let a group of people to like antagonize another group.
That's
right?
true. That's true.
So like it's also important to basically pay attention to like how nationalism or a national identity can also lead to something a bit more toxic. But that might be a longer discussion.
Right.
true.
Yeah.
Right. I think
Yeah.
it works with everything that really endeared to a lot of people's faith or belief.
Yeah. Because sometimes you know how a stronger national identity or it's like a stronger identity can be they can become more enduring if they have like a common enemy, for example.
Yeah, it
Right,
also
yeah.
like creates a walls to people, to groups, I should say.
But basically, I guess pay attention to like be careful not to like let your be careful not to let national identity or nationalism become toxic. Yeah.
Aki,
Yeah.
I think
Can you repeat it once more?
go ahead,
please.
Joe. Once again.
Joe,
No.
can you repeat what you said? Sorry about that.
Yeah, but basically just so that maybe all of us can pay attention, especially with nationalism and everything. We like be aware that it unites you, but be aware that it can also be toxic if you like let it like antagonize like other groups.
That's true.
Right. Yeah.
Just a friendly reminder from Joe.
Because it happens in let's say sports, right? In,
Yeah.
let's say sports
True.
events, like
True.
you can be united. having a national identity. Let's say you can support your national sports team. But then on the other hand, it also leads some people to like attack other countries or citizens of other countries because like
the supporters, right?
Because the support, not just supporters, but basically they might also like attack like the people of the foreign citizens in general with like outside the context of sport because like their national sport team are competing against like each other.
True.
So like just be aware that this can also become like a bit more toxic. Yeah.
I mean, common enemy is a really strong binding element, I guess. But yeah, anyways, I think that's all the time we have, right?
Right?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Yeah. So I guess we should close this episode. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much to our viewers for watching. And stay tuned to our next episode. All right. So
See you guys.
peace out.
Peace out.
Peace out.
Peace out.